love me some post-apocalyptic films and shows, from The Last of Us to Book of Eli, I Am Legend, Reign of Fire, and on and on. It's a fun and dark genre with way too many to list here, so I made a list of my favorite post-apocalyptic films on Letterboxd, which you can find that link below. But a big staple of the genre is the destroyed old world, buildings in ruin, everyday things like cars left to rot, and so on. It's something I've wanted to toy around with for a while now, so, we did. First thing was to get our shot. There's this park near our studio that gave a nice open field to work with as a base, and since this is bare, we could keep the areas that are behind them and leave it untouched if we wanted to, and just build out the world around that. But we did end up deciding to do a ton of roto because, why not? And if that cut in the opening felt a little off, that's because originally we planned to do the shot like this. We start at Justin and we rotate around them to reveal the whole world in one shot, but even though the shot was really smooth, we gave ourselves a billion other difficult hurdles to overcome, like the shallow depth of field, lack of solid detail to latch onto, and so on. So Mattis tried tracking this in After Effects, Blender, Mocha, and several other places, but they all failed. Unsurprisingly. We could have tracked manually, but with our timeline, that wasn't a thing, so we decided to do a cut instead, which, as always, is a good lesson in making sure that you're setting yourself up for success when you're shooting, which, I didn't do this time. Get off my back. Face. And I guess it's also a good lesson in shifting what you have to make it work when your original plan didn't. Another thing we went for to make this easier on ourselves is a very smooth shot. You could do this with a dolly or a slider, or just staying on sticks, or going with a gimbal like this one, the Crane 4 from Juin, who is also today's sponsor. We actually got our hands on this specific gimbal after we shot our open, but I've been testing it for a bit and it's really solid. If you've been looking at this one or just want my flat opinion, I think it's great, especially for single shooter situations, including event shooting, which this built-in light is perfect for. But it's lightweight, great clearance with the arm here for larger cameras, can take a good amount of weight, and makes balancing really simple. So definitely worth a look, link in the notes below. I'll get more into this later in the episode, but that is the Reader Digest version. Before we can add anything to our scene, we need to track our footage, and like I said, our first attempt failed. But with our adjusted shot, things went much more smoothly. In this case, we went with the Blender Native 3D Tracker. Once we have Blender opened up, in the top tab, we'll click on the plus button, VFX, and then motion tracking. And in this workspace, we'll load our footage. Now click prefetch to cache our footage for smoother playback and set scene frames, making sure the scene frame rate matches our frame rate of the original footage. Now we'll let Blender do all the work and create all the tracking markers for us, and we'll use the auto detect features by clicking on this here, then lowering the threshold to something quite low like 0.1 and distance to 80. Next, we'll select all tracking markers by pressing A and start tracking. The markers will get lost, but hey, don't give up. We stopped our track and moved back a couple of frames, then clicked auto detect features again, selected all the markers, and tracked again. Basically just brute forcing it. Whenever they start to disappear, we just add some more. After tracking, we have a huge mess of tracking markers. A lot of them are completely off, which is fine since we are going to clean those up now. If we look at the graph, we can see some markers are going haywire here, and if we click on the spike, we can see corresponding markers, and we can delete by pressing X or delete. But we want the computer to do this work for us because, we don't wanna. In the solve panel, click filter tracks. First, slide the number up to some bigger value like 15, so we are only going to filter the worst ones and then delete them. And now the graph is a lot cleaner. We can also eyeball it and delete some bad markers like the ones that are tracking the actors, for example, since those would confuse the track. In Solve tab, under keyframe A and keyframe B, we're gonna pick a frame range that have fairly different points of view, and after that, we'll set our camera lens in the track tab under camera drop-down menu. If we're not sure about our camera lens, we could always click the focal length toggle in our Solve tab, and the solver will calculate it automatically. Then click on Solve, wait a bit, and check out our pixel error. Everything below 1 pixel is a good track. If the pixel error is higher, we can always clean it up some more using clean tracks. And if we are lucky, we can put in a reprojection error value of 1, which will select any tracking points that drift more than a pixel away from where they're supposed to be. If it's selecting more tracking markers than it should, just put a higher value like 2 or 3. Then click solve again and we have a pixel error less than 1, which is a solid track. Now click set as background to set our tracking footage as the background for our CG camera. We will use this footage to roughly model out a low poly representation of the scene. And lastly, click setup tracking scene. We are going to use our tracking points in the 3D view as guides to create the ground plane, and from that point we're set to start blocking out our actual scene. But before we do, let's take a closer look at the Crane 4. The very first thing that caught my eye with this one is the longer arm we have, which means it can accommodate larger cameras and rigs, still giving you a nice amount of room to tilt. Then you have a solid quick release system here, which is nice for popping right off when you need to. And what's even cooler is you can actually mount the camera on the side here for portrait filming when you need to shoot content 9:16. This is a really smart add and will come in handy for plenty of creators, I'm sure. Another addition here that I haven't seen any other place is a built-in 10-watt fill light, which we can shift from 2700 Kelvin to 5500 Kelvin. For me, I don't see me using this often, but for content creators or event videographers, I think this will be massively helpful. And it's actually surprisingly bright, and if you turn it all the way down, it does do a nice job of giving just a very subtle amount of fill to bring out the subject. But I would assume that it will lessen your battery time a good amount, though I haven't been able to test that yet. On paper, the gimbal gives you 12 hours of shooting, but that's basically in resting mode, so operation, it'll be much less than that. We also have different shooting modes, of course, which we can find inside the menu here, and the menu is something else I appreciate. Really simple and intuitive. I find myself jumping around as if I had been using it before right off the bat. Of course, you have your must-have options here, with follow being the mode I find myself on the most, and this is exactly what it sounds like, the gimbal following your movements with both pan and tilt. And it's smooth, silky smooth, even when running. We are getting a very stable image, which you can of course take even further in post if you wanted. And operating for those smooth shots is helped quite a bit by these two add-ons, the sling grip and the wrist rest. I didn't know what to think of the wrist rest at first. Seemed like it would be annoying, but it actually does help fatigue a lot while shooting with this, especially if you're coupling that with the sling grip in two-handed mode. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. Again, we are going for that post-apocalyptic destroyed city feel using the Last of Us series as our main inspiration. So Mattis grabbed some reference images and started building out some concepts, which is basically just a few cubes here and there creating the composition that we want. Once we're happy with our blockout, we can move to the actual scene build out, which is the fun part. Which, unless you plan to scan or model everything yourself, this means we need a bunch of 3D assets. There's plenty of places that you can get 3D assets, which we've shown a bunch on the show, like Turbo Squid, CG Trader, and Quixel Bridge, but for this one today, we're going to be using assets from Kitbash, which, given a lot of comments that we've gotten lately, I'm going to say no, they're not a sponsor. This is not a commercial for them. They did let us check this out for free, but I have no obligation to put this in an episode. I just think it's really f***ing cool. If you don't know what Kitbash is, it's this really killer 3D assets for all kinds of work. They really make some of the best stuff out there, but what we've been trying out is their new app, Cargo. Like Quixel Bridge, they have all their assets right in here, which I can send directly to Blender with the click of a button. And you have a ton of great kits here. You click in and there's a bunch of assets that all fit together stylistically, or you could go to models and use these options to drill down what you need, including vehicles. And then we have materials here as well. And the coolest part is that there is a free plan. So you could give this a shot now and have access to some of their assets for free. But back on track, next up, we're going to start grabbing those assets that we like and tossing them into our scene, which Mattis ended up mostly using Warzone and Aftermath kits for this. So we'll select the assets and pick the texture resolution, which in our case was mostly 2K and also some 1K resolutions. Then click download and import, and Cargo sends it right to Blender now, so all we need to do is place them into the scene according to our blockout. And we're going to fill this out until it all feels the way that we want, including dropping some trash assets to put more stuff into the foreground, and a couple of tree assets to match our original trees in the background live footage. And this seems overly simplistic, but it really is this simple, which is one of the reasons this portion of the process is the most fun. You just get to be creative and build the world that you want. Which, to be honest, seeing it all now built out there in the final shot, I wish I would have done the shot slightly differently. Maybe start a bit lower and raise up as our actors move toward the world. I think it would have been a better way to convey the danger they were headed toward, having them start much larger in frame and shrink as they move toward the city. We do have that there now, but I think this new idea would have heightened it. With the Crane 4, you do have this sling grip handle like I showed before, before that can help with moves like this. This grip is also extendable, and if we adjust this knob here, we can spin it around to the back for more options when operating in different modes like this here. You also have a 1/4-20 thread at the end as well, so you could mount some accessories there if needed. My only complaint with the wrist rest and the sling grip is that they aren't toolless. I'll admit that that's being a bit picky, since once it's on, but it would be nice not to have to worry about an Allen key while you're out in the field. But let's talk about balancing. First, you have locks on every axis for safety, and getting the system balanced is intuitive and simple and crazy fast, so I won't go into that. But what I really loved right off the bat were these indicator lights. Each motor has its own indicator light that will let you know if the balance is off. So if you need to adjust, the lights shift from white to red, letting you know that you have to adjust. And if you're in a scenario that the lights would be distracting, you do have the control to turn those off right inside the menu here. And speaking of control, a must-have for a gimbal like this is Bluetooth, which we do have here, so you can stop and start recording on your camera as needed right from the grip. So all in all, this is a really solid gimbal that stands toe-to-toe with all the others while having some extra features and still manages to be substantially less expensive. But let's get back to the apocalypse. So we have all our assets in, we're happy with how the scene is looking, so now we're gonna set the rendering layer so that we can bring all of this into After Effects for our final compositing. In our case, we've made main layer containing foreground assets, the ground, grass elements, and basically everything under the horizon level. The next layer was distant trees. Since we are mixing real trees with CG trees, we need to have this layer separated so that we can do more color and blur adjustments later on. Then we have our distant buildings layer, which was split into 3 different layers: front distant buildings, middle distant buildings, and back distant buildings. We did this so that inside of After Effects, we can insert solids in between these layers with low opacity to fake the mist or volumetrics in our scene, since using actual volumetric shaders would be too performance heavy. The last layer is the backdrop, which is a cleaned out freeze frame of the actual footage that will be used as the sky backdrop. Now with all that done, we jump over to After Effects, and the first thing to do here is to separate our actors from the background. Again, we didn't use a green screen, which we really should have, and since we didn't, that means someone has to deal with the frustration of rotoing the actors throughout the shot, and that somebody was Mattis. Sorry, Mattis. But once that was complete, Mattis combined all the layers into this comp. The first layer is our actual footage, and we use this rough mask and animated it throughout the sequence so that we are trimming off all of the parts of the footage which are going to be extended with our CG set extension. On top, we put main CG layer, then distant trees, and then distant building layers, with those solids in between them with low opacity value to mimic volumetrics like we mentioned before. We also use a tint effect on the building layers to have them better match the background and atmosphere. Then we put our background layer in to get back our original sky from the live footage, then some color grade, and there you go. But that's it, a destroyed city look made very easily by using pre-made 3D assets. We're not modelers, we can go out and scan things, but scanning something like a building of that size is next to impossible, so not really something we would do. So this is the way that you would want to do it, but it does free up a lot of that difficulty and lets you just dive in, be creative, and have fun doing it. Links to everything that we've talked about, of course, in the notes below. Until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.